Good morning. It is a gift not to be taken for granted to be gathered in the name of the Lord. And I am so encouraged to see all of you that I can see gathered here this morning in the name of the Lord. I'm also encouraged by those who are gathered as well, maybe listening and watching online, in the name of the Lord, in the same name of the same Lord, bonded by the Spirit that is in us all. Worshiping God, listening to His Word. It is a powerful thing when we can gather, however it is that we gather, in the name of the Lord. I'm glad to spend this moment with all of you, listening to His Word. We are going to continue in Hebrews this morning, but first I want to begin with these words from Psalm 121. It's one of my favorite psalms. That psalm begins with a question. I lift up my eyes to the hills. Where does my help come from? It's a good question, isn't it? Important question. In life and in faith, where does our help come from? And do we have access to the help that we need? I have to admit, I think I have written 3 sermons this week in getting ready for today. You would think that on a week where I spend more time at home and less time watching basketball, that would be a recipe for the fastest finished sermon ever. But it's been kind of a weird week. I don't know if you've heard. And so I've been kind of writing and rewriting this sermon one time over and another time again. But it's these words from Psalm 121 that just keep coming back into my mind again and again. So I've scrapped a story here and I've scrapped a story there and just come back to these words. I lift up my eyes to the hills. Where does my help come from? So that's what I want us to do today. I want us to consider these words and this question. Do we know where our help comes from? Do we have a helper in times of need, in life and in faith? Because to me, our passage from Hebrews this morning is all about these very same questions. Our passage from Hebrews this morning is a passage all about access and all about help. And it asks us this very question that the psalm is asking us to consider. Where does our help come from? And if we know the answer to that question, if you know where your help comes from, how does that change the way that you live today? It's with those questions in mind that I want us to open our Bibles and go to Hebrews chapter 4. Let's talk about the help of the Lord. So it's really the last 3 verses of Hebrews chapter 4 that we want to spend our time with this morning. In these last 3 verses, the writer of Hebrews kind of leaves behind those hard-hitting messages we've heard from chapter 3 and chapter 4, those lessons that are drawn from the story of the Exodus. He kind of leaves those behind for just a moment. And in these last 3 verses, what he offers instead is a message of hope. And as we listen to the words of this message of hope, I want to ask you, as we listen to these words, to be thinking about how these words speak to our access to help in times of need. So let's listen in. Verse 14. Since then we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold fast to our confession. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who in every respect has been tested as we are, yet without sin. Let us therefore approach the throne of grace with boldness, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. So what is this passage saying about the psalm that we read just a moment ago? What is this passage saying to us about our help in times of need? Do we have access to the help that we need? Well, in my mind, I think this passage answers those questions with a resounding yes, right? What these verses are saying to us is that we do, in fact, have a helper in times of need, and that's not just anybody. Who is our helper in times of need? It is the Lord of heaven. The King of earth is our helper. And not only that, but we are invited even in times of need to approach the throne of His grace with boldness, which I take to be, at least in part, a lesson about prayer. We are given access to the throne room of God. We are invited to approach the King of heaven boldly in prayer. And it makes me pause and consider, have I considered lately that when I pray, I am approaching the throne of a mighty God, that the Lord of heaven opens the door for you, that the King of the universe lends His ear to us when we gather in His name? We have access to the help of a Lord and King. May we never lose sight of the awesomeness of that fact. Too easily, I'll admit, I can lose sight of the awesomeness of that fact. When we lift up our eyes and wonder, where does our help come from? We need not look further than the throne room of heaven above. For the Lord of heaven is there for us, our helper in times of need. So Hebrews says you have this helper for you. Hebrews says you have access to the throne of grace. And then it says, here's why, or here's how. It's all because of Jesus. It is all because you have a great high priest. You have access to the throne of grace because, and you may approach the throne of grace because we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, because we have a great high priest who can sympathize with our weaknesses because he shared in our weaknesses, because we have a great high priest who has been tested even as we are, and yet without sin. It's because of these things and the high priest that we have that we may approach the throne of grace with boldness. We have access, you could say, through Jesus, because Jesus is our great high priest. Now, the thing that I want us to notice about that this morning is that when Hebrews calls Jesus a great high priest, he is making a point about access to help. And he's using the Old Testament to do that. So in the Old Testament, the priests of Israel, you may remember some things about them. Others of us, maybe we don't spend a whole lot of time thinking about the day-to-day lives of the priests of Israel way back when. But they actually played a really important role in the life of God's people. And one of the things about them was that it was a small group of people who were set apart for a very important purpose. They were set apart for the spiritual needs of God's people. So they served, in a sense, like mediators for God's people. You could think of them like a go-between. Think of them like a bridge between God and His people and their God. That's what the priests were for the people of Israel. They were that go-between for the spiritual needs of the people. And in order to be that go-between, the Lord gives them access to the holy places in the temple, in the tabernacle, where sacrifices are made, where someone can approach the Lord in times of need. So to be a priest is to be set apart. To be a priest is to be given access. To put this in perspective, I want to show you a picture here. And for those of you who are following along through the live stream, I've posted these slides right below the video. If you want to find them, you can see this picture now or later. This is a picture of the Temple of Israel as we think it may have been around the time of Jesus. And what I want to show you about it is that it was made up into several courts or areas, and these areas were all about access to a holy God. So this outer court here on this side and the other side was the court of the Gentiles. What that means is that both Jews and Gentiles can go into this court. Both Jews and Gentiles have access to this space in the temple. But then as you move in closer to the center, the level of access grows more limited. So, for example, archaeologists found these signs, which says something to the effect of, "No stranger enters beyond this point, this access point. Whoever is caught will be responsible for his ensuing death." It's a sign that says, "No Gentiles beyond this point in the temple." Only the Israelites have access to this next area of the temple. And why is that? Is it just to be rude? It's because you're approaching a holy God. And to approach a holy God when you do not have access is a fearful thing. It would be like approaching a mighty king uninvited. We probably wouldn't do that if you're thinking straight. It's not something you do. Without access, you'd be wiser to flee from a holy God, because how can we stand before him? How can you approach his throne? So the temple is arranged to reflect that. There's these areas of access. No Gentiles beyond this point. But then as you go even further in, there are areas that not even the Israelites can go into. Generally, there's a place called the holy place. And only the priests can go into the holy place. And when they enter, they do this very interesting thing. They put on these robes with 12 stones fastened to the shoulder. Now, why would they do that? And then they put on this plate, this breastplate, right over their chest with 12 stones affixed to that breastplate. Why would they do that? This is not just bedazzled fashion accessories. This is a statement that maybe not everyone can go. Maybe not everyone has access to these holy places, but we go. And when we go, we don't just go for ourselves. 12 stones on the shoulder, 12 stones on the chest. These are for the 12 tribes of Israel. They were a reminder to the priests that when they go, they don't just go for their sake. And when they make sacrifices in the holy place, they have access to do this, not just for their sake. They go, they have access to seek the help of God for all God's people. They have access for a purpose. They're seeking help for sin. They're seeking help in times of need. And then in from there, there's an even holier place. Only one priest, the high priest, can enter into this most holy place, passing through the curtain into the Holy of Holies For there in the Holy of Holies is the Ark of the Covenant, which was sometimes called the mercy seat. Keep that in mind. In the Psalms, God is said to be a king who sits enthroned upon the cherubim, his throne upheld by angels. So when you go into the Holy of Holies, which only the high priest could do, and that once a year, you would find the Ark of the Covenant there adorned with angels, adorned with cherubim. It is an earthly symbol for the heavenly throne of God. And so when the high priest goes into this place, and only he can go, it is as if he is approaching the throne of God, the throne of God's grace. And even though he's just an imperfect person himself, he goes on their behalf, on behalf of the people of God. He's given access to approach the mercy seat, not just for his own help, but for the help of all God's people. I think you can see where I'm going with this. So you see how this picture, with all its many areas, is really all about access and help. Access to a holy God and seeking the help of that God for more than just yourself. The priests of old are set apart to be mediators, and the priests of old are given access for the sake of those who do not have access to those holy places, for their help, for their sin, for their benefit. And the high priest, most of all, has the most access so that he can address the most pressing need. And all of this sets the stage for Christ. And when Christ comes, it totally changes the game. Yes, Christ is in some ways like those high priests before him. He is a human being, like they were and like we are, sharing in our weaknesses, being tempted himself. And Christ, like those high priests before him, is a mediator. He serves that role, offers sacrifice for the people. In some ways, he's like them. But in other ways, what he has done is totally changed the game, because Christ, unlike them and unlike us, was without sin. Everybody who made sacrifices for themselves and for the people. But Christ himself, though tempted in the ways that we are tempted, and though a human being like us, was not like us in that. He was a high priest without sin. And Christ, unlike the high priest before him, passes through the heavens, says verse 14. So the high priest would pass through the curtain of the temple and approach that earthly symbol of the throne of God. Yet here is Christ. He has passed through the heavens, not just once a year, one time, but in unlimited access to the fullness of the holiness and the help of our God. And just like the priest before him, Christ offers a sacrifice, but as we know, all the priests before him offer many sacrifices year after year. What Christ has done, he has offered one sacrifice, his very self, once and for all. And now he sits down at the right hand of God in the throne room of God for our help, for our benefit. Christ has changed the game. Not only has he offered his very life, not only has he mediated for our sins once and for all, but he has even changed the game when it comes to our access to the help we need. So do you remember how in this picture, The people needed a priest to go to those places that they could not themselves go. They needed someone to go on their behalf into those holy places. Do you remember what Hebrews said? Do you remember what Hebrews invited us to do because of Jesus? To approach the mercy seat. To approach the throne of grace with boldness so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in times of need. In other words, we now have access to the help and presence of God in a more intimate and immediate and complete way than ever before imagined. And it's all because of our great high priest and what he has done for us. Because of Jesus, through Jesus, we have help in times of need. Because of Jesus, we have access to God's grace. Because of Jesus, we may come before our God confidently and seek his help in times of need. So what does that mean for you and me this morning? Well, I can think of three things we might take with us today. First and foremost, if Christ is indeed our great high priest, and if he has made the grace of God accessible to us, then perhaps it is time for us, if we have not yet done so, to obtain the grace that he has made accessible by obeying his word in the gospel, repenting of our sins, being baptized in his name. We are raised up to walk in newness of life. We are raised up to stand boldly before the throne of the God, accessing his grace that we do not deserve, able to stand where we should not be able to stand, all because of Jesus and what he has done for us. If Christ has made this grace accessible, then perhaps how we respond is by taking hold of that grace today. Maybe that's the message for you. This passage also tells us that Christ has made it possible to approach the throne of God with boldness, with confidence. We have access to the help of God above. I think we ought to make use of that. Maybe what this passage is meant to do for us is to awaken us from the drowsiness of bold prayer, approaching the Lord with boldness, seeking his help in life and in faith and in times of need. Christ has given us access like never before. What a shame, what a loss, if we do not make use of that. God has not given us a spirit of timidity or fear, but a spirit of love and power, sincerity. Let's do the thing we're invited to do. Let's go before our God boldly in prayer today and this week. And then lastly, I would say let's not forget that it's not for our sake alone that we are invited to approach the throne of grace. You remember how the priests, they went into the holy places, not just for themselves. And the high priest, when he would go into the Holy of Holies, he went there not just for himself. And certainly when Jesus gives his life on the cross and passes through the heavens, he doesn't just do that for himself. He does that for our sake also. And now we are invited to approach the throne of grace with boldness. May we do so, not just for ourselves, but for all of those who need help in times of need, for all of those who might share in the grace that God has made accessible. If we know where our help comes from, then shouldn't we use that for more than just ourselves? Because the reality is many people today and every day, lift up their eyes and do not know where their help will come from. But if we are ready to finish that verse and say, my help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. If we realize the awesome power of the help that Christ has made accessible to us, that changes the way we live. It changes the way we go about our lives. It changes the way we go before our Father in prayer. It changes the way we see the world and those who, like us, might need the help that only God can provide. Maybe today we need to respond to this message. Perhaps what we do is respond to the grace that He's made available in baptism. Maybe your response is to go boldly before our God in prayer for yourself, for our family, for our neighbors, for all of those who may lift up their eyes and not know where to turn. Let's go to God for them. And let's live our lives as an example to all while we stand and while we sing.